I'm just thrilled to be here with you and to have a chance to talk to you about the letter that shook the world, the letter to Romans, the letter that changed the world. There has been a handout that's been passed out, and I want you to know that handout doesn't have anything to do with what I'm going to talk about tonight. That's for free. You can take that home, you can throw it away, you can make cigarettes with it. Don't make cigarettes with it, that would be bad for your health. You can do anything with it you want, but that's just free. But that handout is kind of built on the way that Martin Luther read Romans. Now, a point that I'll get to at the end tonight is that the way that Martin Luther read Romans is not the only way to read Romans, but it is a very powerful way and a very helpful way, I think. As we celebrate, the Reformation and this being the 500th anniversary of the letter that changed the world. My clicker, there we go. That's not supposed to be up there. But you know that we have celebrated the 500th year of the Reformation, yes? Nod, yes, okay, good. Martin Luther was a Catholic priest in Germany in the early 1500s and was unhappy with some of the things that his church was teaching. Could you turn that monitor around so I can see what the slides show?
I'm sorry.
It can't? Okay. All right. That's fine. He was unhappy with some of the things that the church was teaching. And one of the things that he was particularly unhappy with was the selling of forgiveness, or the selling of what were called indulgences. You may have heard that term. And so Luther began preparing to confront this. He was not a shy, quiet individual. He was a big, blustering man. And Luther began studying his Bible to prepare him to confront this practice of selling indulgences. And one of the things he studied as he was preparing for this was he studied what the Bible said about how sins are forgiven. Now that's an important point. And you need to hang on to that, because that will be important when we get to the end of the lesson, talk, lecture, whatever it is I'm doing. Martin Luther went into this wanting to know about what the Bible said about forgiveness of sin. And so that's what he was looking for when he got into Paul's letter to the Romans. And he studied the Bible for several years. Finally, in 1517, he nails the 95 Theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg, Germany. And that's regarded as the birth of the Reformation. So, Luther, in the end, his understanding of forgiveness based on Romans follows a pattern. And the pattern is, very simply, bad news, good news. And so we have the bad news first and then the good news second. And it really all springs not just from how he understood Romans, or even how he understood a couple of verses out of Romans, but really how he understood one particular phrase out of Paul's letter to the Romans. And so here's the verse, the two verses with the pivotal phrase highlighted. And it's Romans 1:16 and 17. Where Paul writes this. Paul says, "I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is God's power for the salvation of everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For the righteousness of God is revealed in the gospel from faith to faith, just as it is written, the righteous by faith will live." Now that phrase there, the righteousness of God, is what Luther had all of his problems with initially. That phrase is what Luther was stumbling over as he thought about how sins are forgiven and what Paul says about the good news. Romans chapter 1, verse 17. The gospel reveals God's righteousness. Luther is wrestling with this. What does that mean? In his mind, God's righteousness is God's righteous authority to condemn sinners. That is how the Catholic Church at the time taught this particular phrase. That's what it was talking about. God's righteousness is revealed. It reveals God's majesty, God's glory, God's righteous stance by which God is holy and we are not. And therefore God is able to condemn us. And Luther, as he is reading this, is really struggling with that phrase. The righteousness of God is revealed. And he writes in a letter at the end of his life, He says, I said to myself, I'm a priest and I'm a good man, quote unquote, but I still have sin and rebellion in my life. And because I still have sin and rebellion in my life, then I am condemned by God's righteousness. And he said to himself, the people in my church, they're not priests, they're just people, and they also are condemned by God's righteousness. And so Luther is really struggling with this, and the question in his mind is, if the gospel is about God's righteousness, and God's righteousness is about how God condemns sin, then how in the world is the gospel good news? It doesn't sound like good news to him. Does it sound like good news to you so far? It doesn't sound like good news to me either. I can see why Luther would struggle with that. I can see why he would have a problem.